In the summer of 1906, the small town of Cortland, New York, buzzed with the quiet hum of ordinary life. Factories churned, church bells rang, and the Cortland Skirt Company stood as a cornerstone of the community, employing dozens of young women who stitched dreams into fabric. Among them was Grace Brown, a 19-year-old with soft brown eyes and a smile that could warm even the coldest mornings. Grace was no stranger to hard work. Raised on a dairy farm in South Otselic, she'd traded rural simplicity for the rhythm of the city, seeking a life beyond the fields. But what no one in Cortland could have known was that Grace's heart was already entangled in a secret that would soon unravel into one of the most infamous crimes of the era. Grace was beautiful, not in the flamboyant way of city socialites, but in a quiet, unassuming grace that drew people in. Her laughter was infectious, her demeanor kind, and her dreams modest yet fervent. She wanted love, a family, a future where she could be more than a factory girl. It was in the bustling halls of the skirt factory that she first met Chester Gillette, the nephew of the factory's owner. Chester was everything Grace was not: polished, charismatic, and dripping with ambition. At 22, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew the world was his to conquer. His dark eyes and easy smile made him a favorite among the workers, but it was Grace who caught his attention. Their romance began in stolen glances across the factory floor. A brush of hands as they passed in the hallway. Whispers during lunch breaks, hidden from the prying eyes of supervisors. Chester was charming, weaving tales of adventure and a future filled with promise. To Grace, he was a beacon of something more, a chance to escape the monotony of her life. But there was a shadow beneath his charm, a restlessness that Grace couldn't see. Chester was a man of contradictions, torn between his desires and the expectations of his wealthy family. He courted Grace in secret, knowing his uncle would never approve of a romance with a working-class girl. As weeks turned to months, their relationship deepened, but so did its secrecy. Grace began to notice the way Chester's eyes wandered, how he spoke of grand plans that never included her. She wrote him letters, pouring her heart onto the page, her words a mix of love and longing. "I dream of you every night, Chester," she wrote in one, her handwriting delicate but firm. "I know we can be happy, if only you'd let the world see us." But Chester's replies were sparse, his tone growing distant. Grace didn't know it then, but those letters would become a haunting record of a love that was doomed from the start. By the spring of 1906, Grace was no longer the carefree girl who'd arrived in Cortland. Her smiles were fewer, her eyes heavy with worry. Whispers began to circulate among the factory girls, rumors of a scandal, of a secret that Grace carried like a weight. She confided in a friend, her voice trembling, that she was in trouble. The kind of trouble that could ruin a woman in 1906. The kind of trouble that Chester Gillette, with his polished suits and lofty dreams, would never stand for. Grace was pregnant, and the man she loved was slipping away. If you're fascinated by cases like this, make sure to hit subscribe and join us here at the Crime O'Clock, where every case is a ticking mystery waiting to be solved. What was it about Chester Gillette that made Grace fall so deeply? And what was he hiding behind that charming facade? The answers lie in the shadows of their secret love, a love that would soon lead to a tragedy that shocked the nation. Grace Brown's world was unraveling, one letter at a time. By the early summer of 1906, the air in Cortland, New York, carried the weight of her secrets. The factory hum of the Cortland Skirt Company, once a comforting rhythm, now felt like a pulse counting down to disaster. Grace's hands trembled as she stitched, her mind consumed by the words she poured into her letters to Chester Gillette. Those letters, written in the quiet of her boarding house room, were her lifeline to a man who seemed to drift further away with each passing day. They were also a ticking clock, each word etching the path to a tragedy that would echo through history. Grace's letters were raw, unguarded, and heartbreakingly sincere. She wrote of her love for Chester, of dreams they'd shared in stolen moments, of a future where they could be together openly. "I can't bear the thought of you ashamed of me," she wrote in one, her pen pressing hard against the paper. "Tell me you love me, Chester, and I'll face anything." But Chester's responses, when they came, were cold, evasive. He spoke of his ambitions, of parties with Cortland's elite, of a life that felt worlds apart from Grace's modest hopes. To him, she was becoming a complication, a shadow threatening his carefully curated image. The factory girls began to notice Grace's change. Her once bright eyes were now rimmed with worry, her laughter replaced by a quiet unease. She confided in a close friend, Lila, about her pregnancy, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says he'll take care of it," Grace said, clutching a crumpled letter. "But he won't look at me the same." Lila urged her to confront Chester, to demand he take responsibility, but Grace hesitated. She loved him still, clinging to the hope that the man who'd swept her off her feet would come through. Yet, the more she wrote, the more desperate her tone became. "If you leave me now, Chester, I don't know what I'll do," she wrote in June, her words a plea and a warning. Chester, meanwhile, was living a double life. By day, he worked at his uncle's factory, charming supervisors and workers alike. By night, he mingled with Cortland's high society, attending dances and dinners where Grace could never follow. Rumors swirled that he'd caught the eye of other women, wealthier women, women his family would approve of. Grace heard the whispers, and they cut deeper than she'd admit. Her letters began to carry a new tone, one of fear and suspicion. "You're different now," she wrote. "Are you ashamed of me? Are you ashamed of us?" The us she referred to wasn't just their love. It was the child she carried, a secret that could ruin them both in the eyes of 1906 society. As July approached, Grace's desperation grew. She wrote Chester daily, her letters piling up unanswered. She begged him to meet her, to talk, to make a plan. Finally, he agreed. He proposed a trip, just the two of them, to the Adirondacks, a place where they could be alone, away from prying eyes. Grace clung to this promise like a lifeline, believing it was a chance to save their love. She packed her bags, her heart heavy with hope and dread, unaware that Chester's intentions were far darker than she could imagine. Chester Gillette was a man who wore charm like a well-tailored suit, but beneath it lay a darkness that few could see. In the summer of 1906, as Cortland, New York, shimmered under the July sun, Chester's life seemed to be a tapestry of opportunity. The nephew of a wealthy factory owner, he had access to a world of privilege that Grace Brown could only dream of. Yet, as Grace's letters grew more desperate, Chester's demeanor remained cool, calculated, and increasingly distant. To those who knew him, he was a rising star, handsome, articulate, and destined for greatness. But to Grace, he was becoming something else entirely, a shadow that loomed over her future, threatening to swallow it whole. Chester was born into modest circumstances in Montana, but his uncle's success in Cortland had elevated him to a life of possibility. He'd attended preparatory schools, rubbing shoulders with the sons of industrialists, and carried himself with an air of entitlement. At the Cortland Skirt Company, he was a supervisor, a role that gave him authority over the workers, including Grace. His charm was effortless. He could make anyone feel special with a smile or a kind word. But there was a restlessness in him, a hunger for status that clashed with his secret romance. Grace, with her simple dreams and working-class roots, was a risk to the life he envisioned. As Grace's pregnancy became impossible to ignore, Chester's behavior grew erratic. He avoided her at the factory, his once warm glances replaced by fleeting, uneasy looks. He spent more time at social gatherings, where he courted the attention of women from Cortland's elite circles. One name, in particular, began to surface in whispers: Harriet Benedict, the daughter of a prominent local family. Harriet was everything Grace was not: wealthy, connected, and a perfect match for Chester's ambitions. The factory girls noticed how Chester's eyes lit up when Harriet's name was mentioned, and words soon reached Grace. Her letters reflected her growing fear. "Do you love her, Chester? Is that why you won't see me?" Chester's double life was unraveling, but he was careful to keep up appearances. To his uncle, he was the dutiful nephew, eager to prove his worth. To his social circle, he was the charming bachelor, always ready with a witty remark. But to Grace, he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. When she pressed him about their future, he offered vague promises: a trip, a chance to talk things over. He suggested Big Moose Lake in the Adirondacks, a remote spot where they could be alone. Grace, clinging to hope, saw it as a chance to rekindle their love. But Chester's mind was elsewhere, spinning plans that Grace could never have imagined. The weight of Grace's secret was crushing her, but Chester seemed untouched. He packed for the trip with a calm precision, his suitcase holding more than just clothes. Among his belongings was a tennis racket, an odd choice for a romantic getaway. To those who saw him leave Cortland, he appeared carefree, even cheerful. But there was a coldness in his eyes, a detachment that hinted at something sinister. As he and Grace boarded the train, her heart raced with a mix of hope and dread. Chester, however, was already looking beyond her, toward a future where she no longer existed. The train rattled through the lush greenery of upstate New York, carrying Grace Brown and Chester Gillette toward Big Moose Lake in the Adirondacks. It was July 11th, 1906, and the summer air was thick with the promise of escape. For Grace, the trip was a beacon of hope, a chance to reclaim the love she feared was slipping away. Her heart fluttered with nervous anticipation as she sat beside Chester, her small suitcase packed with dreams of a future together. But Chester's demeanor was different, cool, detached, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape. The serene beauty of the Adirondacks, with its towering pines and shimmering lakes, masked the darkness that was about to unfold. Grace had spent the days leading up to the trip in a haze of emotion. Her letters to Chester had grown frantic, pleading for reassurance that he still loved her, that he would stand by her and their unborn child. His agreement to this getaway had felt like a lifeline, a sign that he was ready to face their future together. She wore her best dress, a soft blue that complemented her eyes, and clutched a small hat box, a gift from Chester in happier times. To anyone watching, they were a young couple on a romantic retreat, but the truth was far more complicated. Big Moose Lake was a quiet, isolated spot, popular among city dwellers seeking respite in nature. The couple checked into the Glenmore Hotel under assumed names, Chester as Carl Graham, and Grace as his wife. The alias was Chester's idea, a precaution, he said, to avoid gossip. Grace, naive and trusting, agreed, though the secrecy gnawed at her. They spent the first day walking the lake shores, the water lapping gently against the rocks. Grace tried to draw Chester into conversation, her voice soft but hopeful. "We could be happy here, couldn't we?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Chester's replies were vague, his smile strained, as if his mind was elsewhere. On July 12th, Chester suggested a boat ride on the lake. Grace, eager to please, agreed, her heart lifting at the thought of a quiet moment together. They rented a small rowboat, and Chester packed a picnic basket, along with his tennis racket, an odd item that drew a curious glance from the boatman. As they pushed off from the shore, the lake was calm, its surface a mirror reflecting the clear sky. Grace sat facing Chester, her hands folded in her lap, unaware that the man rowing her into the lake's depths was not the lover she trusted but a stranger with a chilling plan. The boat drifted toward a secluded cove, far from the hotel's prying eyes. Grace's chatter slowed as she noticed Chester's silence, his hands gripping the oars with a tension she couldn't place. "Chester, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the water. The lake, so peaceful moments before, now felt oppressive, its stillness a prelude to something unthinkable. Grace's heart pounded as the boat rocked gently, the distance between her and safety growing with every stroke. If you're gripped by the suspense of Grace and Chester's fateful journey, hit that subscribe button and join us at the Crime O'Clock, where every case is a ticking mystery waiting to be solved. What was Chester planning as he rowed Grace into the heart of Big Moose Lake? And why did that tennis racket feel like a clue to something far more sinister? The truth lies just beneath the surface, waiting to break free. The waters of Big Moose Lake were still as glass on the afternoon of July 12, 1906, reflecting the endless blue of a summer sky. Grace Brown, her heart heavy with hope and fear, sat in the small rowboat as Chester Gillette rowed them deeper into the lake's secluded embrace. The Adirondacks, with their whispering pines and tranquil beauty, seemed a world away from the factory floors of Cortland. But beneath the serene surface of the lake, a tragedy was unfolding, one that would shatter the quiet of this remote paradise and send shockwaves through the nation. Grace's voice was soft, almost lost in the gentle lapping of the water against the boat. She spoke of their future, of the child they were expecting, her words laced with a desperate need for reassurance. "Chester, we can make this work, can't we?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for the love she'd once known. But Chester's expression was unreadable, his hands steady on the oars as he guided the boat toward a shadowed cove. The tennis racket he'd brought lay at his feet, its presence an unspoken question mark in the stillness. What happened next would become the subject of endless speculation, a moment so shrouded in mystery that it would haunt investigators and storytellers for generations. According to later accounts, the boat rocked suddenly, violently. Grace, caught off guard, reached for the edge, her fingers grasping at nothing. A splash broke the silence, followed by a muffled cry that faded into the lake's depths. When the water settled, the boat was empty, save for Chester, who rowed back to shore alone, his face pale but composed. Grace Brown was gone, her body swallowed by the lake, her dreams extinguished in a matter of moments. Chester returned to the Glenmore Hotel that evening, his clothes dry, his demeanor eerily calm. He told the staff he'd last seen Grace on the shore, that she'd decided to take a walk while he returned the boat. The lie was smooth, rehearsed, but the hotel staff noticed something off. His story didn't quite add up, and the absence of Grace was impossible to ignore. By the next morning, whispers of concern rippled through the hotel. A search was organized, and the lake's placid surface was scoured for any sign of the young woman who'd checked in as Mrs. Carl Graham. Late that afternoon, the searchers found her. Grace's body lay beneath the water, her blue dress tangled in the weeds, her face frozen in a silent scream. The discovery sent a chill through the Adirondacks, a place unaccustomed to such horror. Her body bore marks that told a story far darker than an accidental drowning, a bruise on her forehead, a gash that spoke of violence. The picnic basket and hat box were recovered nearby, but the tennis racket was nowhere to be found. The question hung heavy in the air. What had Chester Gillette done? The discovery of Grace Brown's body in the depths of Big Moose Lake sent a tremor through the Adirondacks. It was July 13, 1906, and the serene beauty of the lake was forever tainted by the grim reality of what had happened. The small community around the Glenmore Hotel buzzed with shock and suspicion, their whispers converging on one name, Chester Gillette. The young man who'd checked in with Grace, calling her his wife, had returned alone, his story flimsy and his demeanor too calm for a man who'd lost his companion. As the local authorities descended on the scene, the investigation into Grace's death began to unravel a web of deception that would grip the nation. Sheriff Henry Burke, a weathered man accustomed to petty disputes, not murder, took charge of the case. The initial assumption was drowning, an accident, perhaps, given the lake's deceptive currents. But Grace's body told a different story. The bruise on her forehead, the gash near her temple, and the absence of water in her lungs suggested she was dead before she hit the water. The picnic basket and hat box were recovered, but the missing tennis racket loomed large, a peculiar detail that gnawed at the investigators. Why would Chester bring such an item on a romantic boat ride? And where was it now? Chester, meanwhile, had left the Glenmore Hotel the morning after Grace's disappearance, heading to a nearby resort where he rejoined friends as if nothing had happened. He laughed, played cards, and spoke of future plans, his charm unshaken. But his carefree act crumbled when Sheriff Burke tracked him down. Under questioning, Chester's story wavered. He claimed Grace had been despondent, that she'd wandered off after their boat ride, perhaps overwhelmed by her troubles. But the hotel staff recalled his dry clothes, his unshaken demeanor, and the alias he'd used. Suspicion hardened into certainty. Chester Gillette was hiding something. The investigation turned to Grace's letters, discovered in her boarding house room in Cortland. Each one was a window into her heart, revealing her love, her fear, and her growing desperation. "Chester, why won't you answer me?" she'd written in one. "I'm so afraid of what will happen if you leave me." The letters painted a picture of a woman trapped by her circumstances, clinging to a man who seemed to care less with each passing day. They also hinted at Chester's double life, his flirtations with other women, his ambition to climb the social ladder, and his refusal to acknowledge the child Grace carried. Physical evidence began to mount. A local fisherman reported seeing a man matching Chester's description near the lake the evening of the murder, carrying something heavy wrapped in cloth. Searchers scoured the woods and found the missing tennis racket, its strings stained with what appeared to be blood. The discovery was damning, a silent witness to the violence that had taken place. Chester was arrested, his polished exterior cracking under the weight of the evidence. As he sat in a cell, the small town of Herkimer, New York, prepared for a trial that would draw the eyes of the nation. The small town of Herkimer, New York, was unprepared for the storm that descended upon it in November of 1906. The courthouse, a modest brick building on the town square, became the epicenter of a spectacle that would captivate the nation. Chester Gillette, the charming factory supervisor with dreams of grandeur, stood accused of the murder of Grace Brown, the young woman whose love for him had become her undoing. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a drama of love, betrayal, and ambition, played out before a packed gallery of reporters, locals, and curious onlookers who hung on every word. The nation called it the trial of the century, and for good reason. Every detail seemed ripped from the pages of a scandalous novel. The prosecution, led by District Attorney George Ward, painted a chilling portrait of Chester as a cold-blooded manipulator. They presented Grace's letters, read aloud in the courtroom to a hushed audience. Each word was a dagger, revealing her desperation and Chester's indifference. "I am in trouble, Chester, and you are the only one who can help me," she'd written, her voice echoing through the pages. The letters were damning, showing a man who'd promised love but delivered only deceit. Ward argued that Chester, desperate to preserve his social ambitions, had lured Grace to Big Moose Lake with a plan to silence her forever. Physical evidence bolstered the prosecution's case. The tennis racket, found hidden in the woods with traces of blood, was displayed before the jury, its presence a grim reminder of the violence on the lake. Medical experts testified that Grace's injuries, a bruise on her forehead and a gash near her temple, suggested a deliberate blow, not an accident. The absence of water in her lungs was the final nail. Grace was dead before she entered the water. Ward's voice thundered as he described Chester rowing Grace to that secluded cove, his intentions as dark as the lake's depths. Chester's defense team, led by the seasoned Albert Mills, fought to save their client from the electric chair. They portrayed Chester as a young man caught in a tragic misunderstanding, insisting that Grace's death was an accident. Chester took the stand, his voice steady but his eyes darting nervously. He claimed the boat had capsized, that Grace had panicked and fallen, striking her head. He said he tried to save her, but was overcome by fear and fled. The story was flimsy, contradicted by his dry clothes and calm demeanor at the hotel, but Mills leaned on Chester's charm, hoping to sway the jury. The courtroom was a theater of emotion. Grace's family sat in the front row, their faces etched with grief as her letters were read. Chester's mother, a devout woman, wept silently, unable to reconcile the son she knew with the man on trial. Reporters scribbled furiously, their stories feeding a public hungry for every twist. Outside, crowds gathered, debating Chester's guilt or innocence, while newspapers across the country printed sensational headlines, "Lover or Killer," and the Adirondack tragedy. The trial wasn't just about a crime. It was a window into a society grappling with class, morality, and the cost of ambition. If you're gripped by the drama of Chester Gillette's trial, make sure to hit subscribe and join us at the Crime O'Clock, where every case is a ticking mystery waiting to be solved. Would the jury see through Chester's polished exterior? Or would his charm cast just enough doubt to save him? The courtroom is electric with tension, and the verdict is drawing near. The Herkimer courthouse was a cauldron of tension as the trial of Chester Gillette stretched into its second week in November 1906. The air was thick with anticipation, every seat filled with spectators who leaned forward, hanging on every word. The prosecution had built a formidable case, weaving Grace Brown's desperate letters, the blood-stained tennis racket, and the chilling evidence of her injuries into a narrative of premeditated murder. Yet, Chester's defense team clung to the hope that his charm and their carefully crafted story of an accidental drowning could sway the jury. The line between guilt and innocence was razor thin, and the whispers in the courtroom echoed the doubts that lingered in the minds of all who watched. District Attorney George Ward called witness after witness to dismantle Chester's story. The boatman who rented the rowboat testified that Chester had seemed unusually calm, asking for a boat sturdy enough for two, but never mentioning a picnic or a romantic outing. A hotel maid recounted how Chester had returned alone, his clothes pristine, his demeanor unshaken, as if he'd merely taken a stroll. He didn't seem like a man who'd lost someone, she said, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. The most damning testimony came from a local doctor, who described Grace's injuries in grim detail. A blow to the head, delivered with force, likely from a blunt object like the tennis racket. The courtroom gasped as he concluded. She was struck before she entered the water. Chester's defense attorney, Albert Mills, fought back with a strategy that leaned heavily on character. He called friends and family to testify to Chester's good nature, painting him as a young man caught in a tragic misunderstanding. Chester's mother took the stand, her voice trembling as she described her son as kind-hearted, incapable of violence. But her testimony faltered under cross-examination, as Ward pressed her on Chester's evasiveness about Grace. The defense's strongest card was Chester himself, who maintained his story of a boating accident. His voice was smooth, his eyes meeting those of the jurors, but there was a coldness in his delivery that unsettled some. "I loved Grace," he said. "I would never hurt her." Yet, the jury couldn't ignore the letters, where Grace's fear of abandonment was palpable. Outside the courthouse, the case had become a national obsession. Newspapers dissected every detail, from Grace's modest upbringing to Chester's flirtations with Cortland's elite. Some painted Grace as a naive victim, others as a woman who trapped Chester with her pregnancy. Chester was alternately a heartless villain or a misunderstood youth, depending on the headline. The public was divided, and so was the jury, as deliberations loomed. Whispers circulated that some jurors found Chester's charm persuasive, while others couldn't reconcile his story with the evidence. The missing tennis racket, the bruises on Grace's body, and her haunting letters weighed heavily against him. As the trial neared its climax, the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker. Grace's family sat in silent agony, their grief a stark contrast to Chester's composed exterior. The question hung in the air. Could a man so polished, so seemingly refined, commit such a brutal act? Or was there just enough doubt to spare him? The answer rested with 12 men, whose decision would shape not only Chester's fate, but the legacy of a tragedy that had captured a nation's heart. The Herkimer Courthouse was a crucible of silence on November 28, 1906, as the jury filed back into the packed courtroom. For nearly 2 weeks, the trial of Chester Gillette had held the nation in its grip, a sordid tale of love, betrayal, and murder that unfolded like a Shakespearean tragedy. Grace Brown's desperate letters, the blood-stained tennis racket, and the chilling image of her body pulled from Big Moose Lake had painted a damning picture. Yet, Chester's composed demeanor and the defense's plea for an accidental death had sown just enough doubt to keep the outcome uncertain. As the foreman stood to deliver the verdict, every breath in the room seemed to pause, waiting for the words that would seal Chester's fate. District Attorney George Ward sat with a steely gaze, confident that the evidence, Grace's injuries, her heart-wrenching letters, and Chester's flimsy alibi, had closed the noose around the defendant. The defense, led by Albert Mills, had fought valiantly, leaning on Chester's charm and the possibility of a tragic mishap. But the jury, 12 men from the quiet towns of upstate New York, had deliberated for hours, wrestling with the weight of a life in their hands. The gallery, filled with reporters, locals, and Grace's grieving family, leaned forward, the air thick with anticipation. Chester sat motionless, his face a mask of calm, though his hands betrayed a slight tremor. "Guilty," the foreman declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs that grew into a low roar. Chester's mother let out a choked sob, while Grace's family bowed their heads, tears mixing with relief. The jury had convicted Chester Gillette of first-degree murder, finding that he had deliberately struck Grace and left her to die in the cold waters of Big Moose Lake. The judge's gavel fell, and the sentence was clear: death by electric chair. Chester's mask finally cracked, his eyes widening for a fleeting moment before he regained his composure, as if refusing to let the world see him break. The verdict was a sensation, splashed across front pages from New York to San Francisco. "Gillette guilty of lover's murder," screamed the headlines. accompanied by sketches of Chester's stoic face and Grace's haunting portrait. The public, already consumed by the scandal, debated the outcome fiercely. Some saw justice served for a woman betrayed by a callous lover. Others believed Chester's youth and charm should have spared him. The trial had exposed the raw edges of class and morality in early 20th century America, where a factory girl's life seemed to weigh less than a wealthy man's ambition, until the law spoke otherwise. As Chester was led back to his cell, the reality of his fate settled in. Appeals were filed, but hope was slim. Grace's letters, once private pleas for love, had become public evidence of her killer's heartlessness. They were read and reread, printed in newspapers, and discussed in parlors, ensuring that her voice would not be forgotten. The verdict was more than a legal judgment. It was a reckoning for a man who thought he could escape the consequences of his choices. If you're riveted by the justice served in Grace Brown's name, hit that subscribe button and join us at the Crime O'Clock, where every case is a ticking mystery waiting to be solved. What would Chester's final days reveal about his guilt? And how would Grace's story echo beyond the courtroom? The tragedy is nearing its end, but its shadow lingers. The echo of the gavel in the Herkimer courthouse marked the end of Chester Gillette's trial, but the story of Grace Brown's murder was far from over. It was December 1906, and the nation remained transfixed by the scandal that had unfolded in the Adirondacks. Chester, now a convicted murderer, awaited his fate in Auburn prison, where the electric chair loomed like a specter. Grace's death, once a private tragedy, had become a public obsession, her letters immortalizing her as both victim and voice of a generation. The case was more than a crime. It was a mirror held up to a society wrestling with love, class, and the cost of ambition, and its legacy would ripple for decades. Chester's appeals dragged on for nearly 2 years, each one a desperate bid to escape the death penalty. His defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the jury had been swayed by emotion rather than fact. But Grace's letters, read aloud in court and reprinted in newspapers, were too powerful to dismiss. "I am lost without you, Chester," she had written, her words a haunting reminder of her trust and his betrayal. The courts upheld the verdict, and on March 30th, 1908, Chester Gillette was executed, his final moments marked by a stoic silence that left onlookers wondering if he ever felt remorse. Grace's family returned to their quiet life in South Otselic, forever scarred by the loss of their daughter. Her mother kept her letters, unable to part with the last pieces of Grace's heart. The Cortland Skirt Company continued its work, but the factory girls spoke of Grace in hushed tones, her story a cautionary tale of love's dangers. In the Adirondacks, Big Moose Lake became a place of pilgrimage for the curious, its serene waters now synonymous with tragedy. The Glenmore Hotel, once a quaint retreat, saw visitors drawn by the dark allure of the crime, each hoping to glimpse the cove where Grace's life ended. The case inspired more than just whispers. In 1908, Theodore Dreiser began work on An American Tragedy, a novel that would draw heavily on Grace and Chester's story, cementing its place in cultural history. The book, later adapted into films and plays, explored the clash of ambition and morality, with Grace's fictional counterpart, Roberta Alden, becoming a symbol of innocence betrayed. The public's fascination never waned, as the case was retold in articles, books, and even songs, each version grappling with the same question: how could love lead to such darkness? Grace Brown's murder was a turning point, exposing the fragility of trust and the weight of societal expectations. It challenged the notion that a man like Chester could escape justice by virtue of his charm and status. Her letters, once private, became a testament to her strength, ensuring that her voice would outlive her killer. The tragedy of Big Moose Lake remains a haunting reminder that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will always rise to the surface. What do you think really happened in that cove on Big Moose Lake? Was Chester a monster, or a man trapped by his own ambitions? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery might already be ticking.